I drove an injured stranger to the hospital, and now I'm being charged with kidnapping and reckless endangerment. The detective slapped the arrest warrant on my kitchen table at 6:18 on a Friday morning, the sound echoing through my apartment like a gunshot. Kevin Brennan, you're under arrest for kidnapping, reckless endangerment, and unlawful restraint, Detective Lawrence Cho said, his voice flat and professional. I was holding a coffee mug, still in my pajamas, trying to process what was happening. My brain kept replaying the same thought. This had to be a mistake. I'd saved a woman's life 3 days ago, found her bleeding on the side of Route 9, drove her to Memorial Hospital because she was dying, and couldn't wait for an ambulance that might take 20 minutes to reach that isolated stretch of road. Now 2 officers were standing in my living room with handcuffs, and Detective Cho was reading me my rights while my coffee went cold. I'd been working as a freelance graphic designer for 8 years, living alone in a small apartment complex on the east side of town, maintaining a quiet, predictable routine that revolved around client deadlines and occasional drinks with friends. My life was unremarkable in the best way possible. I paid my bills on time, kept to myself, had never been arrested, never even gotten a speeding ticket. The most dramatic thing that happened to me in an average week was a client asking for endless revisions on a logo design. That changed last Monday evening when I was driving home from a meeting with a potential client in the suburbs, taking Route 9 because it was faster than the highway during rush hour. The road cut through farmland and forest, mostly empty at that time of day, the sun setting behind the trees in that golden hour light that photographers love. I saw her around 7:15 p.m., a figure stumbling along the shoulder about a quarter-mile ahead. At first, I thought she was drunk or maybe having car trouble, but as I got closer, I realized she was hurt. Her clothes were torn, blood visible on her arms and face, her movements uncoordinated like she might collapse at any moment. I pulled over immediately, hazard lights flashing, and got out of my car. She was a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair matted with blood, a deep gash across her forehead that was bleeding heavily. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, possibly broken, and she was barefoot, her feet cut up from walking on the rough pavement. When she saw me, she tried to back away, fear in her eyes, but then she stumbled and nearly fell. I held up my hands, told her I wanted to help, asked what happened. Her voice came out in gasps, barely coherent. Please. Hospital. He's coming back. She kept looking over her shoulder at the tree line, terrified of something I couldn't see. I asked if she wanted me to call 911, but she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and said, "No time, please, just go." The blood was running down her face, dripping onto her shirt. Her pupils looked dilated, possibly concussed. Every first aid course I'd ever taken was screaming at me that she needed immediate medical attention, that waiting for an ambulance on this empty road could mean the difference between life and death. I made a decision in about 3 seconds. I helped her into my passenger seat, fastened her seatbelt, and drove as fast as I safely could toward Memorial Hospital, which was about 15 minutes away. During the drive, she kept drifting in and out of consciousness, mumbling things I couldn't understand. I tried to keep her awake by asking her name, where she lived, what happened, but she'd just shake her head and say, "Keep going. Don't stop." Her breathing was shallow and rapid, signs of shock setting in. Blood was soaking into my passenger seat, and I was terrified she might die before I got her to the ER. I ran 2 red lights, my hazard still flashing, horn honking to warn other cars. When I pulled up to the emergency entrance at 7:32 p.m., I jumped out and ran inside yelling for help. 2 nurses and a doctor came running out with a gurney. They loaded her up and rushed her inside while I stood there shaking, adrenaline crashing, watching them disappear through the automatic doors. A security guard approached and asked me what happened. I explained I'd found her on Route 9, that she was injured and needed help, that I'd driven her here because she seemed critical. The security guard took my information, name, phone number, address, asked a few basic questions about where exactly I'd found her and what condition she was in. Then he told me I could go, that the hospital would handle it from there. I gave him my contact details in case the police needed a statement, then drove home in a daze, my car reeking of blood, my hands still shaking from the adrenaline. I called my friend Marcus to tell him what happened, needing to talk it through with someone. He said I'd done the right thing, that the woman was probably the victim of a car accident or assault, that she was lucky I'd found her. I cleaned the blood out of my passenger seat using towels and disinfectant, the whole process feeling surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to me. Then I went to bed and tried to sleep, my mind replaying the image of her terrified face, the blood, the way she'd kept looking over her shoulder like someone was chasing her. Wednesday morning, 2 days after the incident, I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Cho from the county police department. He said he needed to ask me some questions about an incident on Route 9 involving a woman I'd transported to Memorial Hospital. I told him I was happy to help, relieved actually that they were following up. Cho asked if I could come to the station to give a formal statement. I agreed immediately, thinking this would be routine, that they just needed my account of events, for their records. I had no idea I was walking into an interrogation designed to build a criminal case against me. Looking back, I should have sensed something was wrong when Cho said, "You have the right to bring an attorney." But at the time, I thought that was just standard procedure. The police station was a squat brick building downtown with fluorescent lighting that made everything look washed out and grim. Cho met me in the lobby, shook my hand with a grip that felt more evaluative than friendly, and led me to an interview room. The space was exactly what you'd expect from crime shows. Metal table, uncomfortable chairs, mirror on one wall that was obviously one-way glass. Cho was in his early 50s, trim and professional, with a demeanor that suggested he'd done this thousands of times. He started with basic questions. What time had I found the woman? Where exactly on Route 9? What condition was she in? How long did it take to drive to the hospital? Did she say anything? During the drive? I answered everything honestly, providing as much detail as I could remember. Then Cho's questions shifted. Did the woman ask you to take her to the hospital? He asked, leaning back in his chair. I thought about it. Technically, she'd said hospital, but she hadn't explicitly asked me to drive her. She'd said, no time, and just go, when I offered to call 911. I explained this to Cho, trying to be precise. He made a note. So, she didn't specifically request that you transport her? I said she was in medical distress, couldn't wait for an ambulance, that I'd made a judgment call. Cho nodded slowly. Did you identify yourself? Tell her your name, where you were taking her? I admitted I hadn't, that the situation had been urgent, that I'd focused on getting her to help as fast as possible. Another note. Did you know this woman before Monday evening? No, I'd never seen her before in my life. Did you follow her on Route 9 before stopping? What? No, I'd just been driving home and happened to see her. Cho's expression didn't change, but something about his tone shifted, became more pointed. Mr. Brennan, I need you to understand something. The woman you transported, her name is Angela Kessler, and she's told us a very different story about what happened Monday evening. My stomach dropped. Cho pulled out a file and slid a document across the table. It was a police report, Angela Kessler's statement. According to her account, I'd been following her car on Route 9, forced her off the road, dragged her from her vehicle, assaulted her, then drove her to the hospital against her will. She claimed she'd been trying to escape, that she'd told me repeatedly to let her go, that I'd threatened her and driven recklessly, running red lights and ignoring traffic laws while she was restrained in my passenger seat. The statement was detailed and specific, describing my car, my appearance, the route I'd taken. Reading it felt like reality was fracturing. This was the opposite of what happened. This made me sound like a predator who'd attacked a woman and then staged a rescue to cover my tracks. I looked up at Cho, my hands shaking. This is completely insane. I saved her life. She was bleeding, terrified, begging me to take her to the hospital. I didn't force her to do anything. Cho's expression was professionally neutral. Angela Kessler suffered significant injuries, a fractured skull, broken arm, lacerations, bruising consistent with assault. She was treated at Memorial Hospital and released the next morning. Her family has filed charges against you for kidnapping, reckless endangerment, and unlawful restraint. We have witnesses who saw your vehicle driving erratically through town with a distressed passenger. We have hospital security footage showing you abandoning Ms. Kessler at the emergency entrance. From our perspective, Mr. Brennan, your actions look extremely suspicious. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. This woman, whose life I'd saved, was accusing me of attacking her. I tried to explain again what really happened, but Cho cut me off. He said I should consult with an attorney before making any further statements. The interview was over. I left the police station in a state of shock, my mind unable to process what had just happened. I'd gone in expecting to give a helpful witness statement, and instead found myself implicated in a violent crime. I drove home on autopilot, pulled into my parking spot, sat in my car for 20 minutes just staring at nothing. Then I called the first criminal defense attorney I could find through a Google search, a lawyer named David Winters, who specialized in assault and kidnapping cases. His receptionist said he could see me that afternoon for an emergency consultation. His retainer was $15,000. I agreed without hesitation, using money I'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Winters was in his late 40s, sharply dressed, with the kind of confidence that came from winning difficult cases. He listened to my story without interrupting, making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, Winters set down his pen and looked at me directly. Kevin, I need to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Did anything happen during that drive that could be misinterpreted? Any physical contact? Any argument? Anything that might explain why this woman is accusing you? I shook my head emphatically. The only contact had been helping her into my car and keeping her conscious during the drive. She'd been terrified and injured, not fighting me. Winters nodded. Then we're dealing with either a misunderstanding, psychological trauma affecting her memory, or something more deliberate. Given how detailed her accusations are, I'm leaning toward the third option. People don't fabricate this level of specificity without a reason. He explained that kidnapping charges were extremely serious, carrying potential sentences of 10 to 20 years. Even if I was acquitted, the arrest record and trial would follow me forever. We needed to build an aggressive defense immediately. Winters filed a motion to obtain all evidence related to the case, hospital records, security footage, 911 calls, witness statements. The prosecution was required to provide discovery materials, but it would take time. Meanwhile, I was formally arrested on Friday morning, processed at the county jail, fingerprinted, photographed, and held for arraignment. The bail hearing was surreal. I stood in front of a judge while a prosecutor I'd never met argued I was a flight risk and a danger to the community. Winters countered that I had no criminal record, strong community ties, and credible evidence that I'd acted as a good Samaritan. The judge set bail at $75,000. My parents posted it using their retirement savings as collateral. I was released that afternoon with an ankle monitor and strict conditions. No contact with Angela Kessler, no leaving the county, mandatory. Check-ins with a probation officer twice weekly. My life had been upended in less than a week. The news coverage started almost immediately. Local reporters picked up the story. Graphic designer arrested for kidnapping woman on Route 9. The articles presented Angela Kessler as a victim who'd narrowly escaped a violent predator. They included her statement, her injuries, the frightening details of being driven against her will. My name, my photo from social media, my address, all publicly available. Comment sections filled with people calling me a monster, demanding maximum sentences, speculating about what else I might have done. My clients started canceling contracts, citing reputation concerns. My landlord called asking if I planned to stay in the apartment, mentioning that other tenants were uncomfortable. Friends stopped returning my calls. I was being convicted in the court of public opinion before any trial had even started. The isolation was crushing. I'd gone from anonymity to infamy overnight, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Winters obtained the discovery materials 2 weeks after my arrest. What he found was both damning and confusing. The hospital security footage showed me pulling up to the emergency entrance at 7:32 p.m., exactly as I'd stated. It showed me helping Angela out of my car, supporting her weight as she stumbled. She appeared distressed and injured, but the footage was grainy, taken from a distance. You couldn't hear audio, couldn't see her facial expressions clearly. The prosecution would argue she was trying to escape, and I was restraining her. Multiple witnesses had called 911 reporting a vehicle matching my car's description, driving erratically through town around 7:25 p.m. The calls described seeing a woman in the passenger seat who appeared to be in distress, possibly being held against her will. One witness said they'd tried to follow my car, but lost it when I ran a red light. These calls supported Angela's version of events, not mine. The hospital records showed Angela had been treated for a fractured skull, broken arm, multiple lacerations, and severe bruising. The attending physician's notes, written by Dr. Rachel Mendez with 15 years in emergency medicine, described injuries consistent with assault or serious accident. Importantly, the notes included Angela's initial statement to medical staff. She'd told them she couldn't remember clearly what happened, that she'd been hurt, and someone had driven her to the hospital, but she was confused and disoriented. There was no mention in the initial medical records of her accusing me of anything. That detail only appeared later, after her family arrived. Winters highlighted this discrepancy. Her story changed after she talked to her family. That's significant. It suggests someone influenced her account of events. He'd hired a private investigator named Olivia Cross, a former police detective with 23 years of experience, to look into Angela Kessler's background and family situation. Cross reported back with information that started to paint a different picture. Angela Kessler was married to a man named Richard Kessler, a real estate developer with significant wealth and local political connections. They lived in a large house in an exclusive neighborhood, had been married for 8 years, no children. Richard Kessler had a reputation for being controlling and aggressive in business dealings, multiple lawsuits from former business partners alleging fraud and intimidation. But he was also well-connected, friendly with local politicians, the district attorney, several judges. He donated heavily to campaigns and charities, maintained a public image as a successful philanthropist. Angela had no criminal record, no history of mental illness or false accusations. On paper, she was a typical suburban wife involved in charity work and social clubs. But Cross found something interesting. 3 years ago, Angela had filed a domestic violence complaint against Richard, claiming he'd assaulted her during an argument. The complaint had been withdrawn a week later, and no charges were filed. Winters and I reviewed this information in his office. Richard Kessler has the means and connections to orchestrate a false prosecution, Winters said. If Angela was trying to leave him Monday evening, if he found out and assaulted her, he'd have a strong motive to reframe the narrative. By accusing you of kidnapping, he shifts focus away from himself and creates a story where Angela was victimized by a stranger rather than by her husband. It made terrible sense, but it was also speculation without proof. We needed evidence directly linking Richard to Angela's injuries or demonstrating he'd influenced her accusation. Cross suggested we examine Angela's phone records, financial statements, any communication that might show coercion or coordination with Richard. But obtaining that information legally would require court orders, and the judge might not grant them without substantial justification. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after my arrest. This was where the prosecution would present enough evidence to demonstrate probable cause for a trial. If the judge found their case sufficiently strong, I'd be bound over for trial. If not, the charges might be dismissed or reduced. Winters prepared me extensively for what to expect. The prosecution would call witnesses, present the security footage, introduce Angela's statement, and argue that reasonable people could conclude I'd committed kidnapping and reckless endangerment. We wouldn't present our full defense at this stage, just enough to challenge their narrative. The hearing took place in a courtroom packed with reporters and spectators. Angela Kessler sat in the front row beside her husband, Richard, a tall man in his early 50s with silver hair and an expensive suit. He had his arm around her shoulders in a gesture that looked protective, but struck me as possessive. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Lawson, with 12 years in the office, called Angela as her first witness. Angela took the stand, looking fragile and nervous, her arm still in a cast, a visible scar across her forehead. Lawson walked her through the events of Monday, November 6th. Angela testified that she'd been driving home from a friend's house on Route 9 when my car started following her. She said I'd tailgated aggressively, flashed my high beams, tried to run her off the road. She'd pulled over, frightened, and I'd blocked her car with mine. According to her testimony, I'd approached her vehicle, yanked open her door, and dragged her out. She'd fought back, sustaining injuries during the struggle. Then I'd forced her into my passenger seat, restrained her with the seatbelt, and driven away despite her protests. She said she'd screamed for help, tried to open the door while moving, begged me to let her go. I'd ignored her and driven recklessly to the hospital, where I'd abandoned her at the entrance. Lawson showed Angela the security footage, asking if that was the moment I'd released her. Angela confirmed it was. She described feeling terrified, not knowing if I was taking her to get medical help or to hurt her further. Her voice broke as she spoke, tears running down her face. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Winters cross-examined carefully, asking Angela about her injuries, how she'd sustained them. Angela said they'd happened during the struggle when I dragged her from her car. Winters asked if she'd reported the incident to police immediately after being treated at the hospital. Angela said no, she'd been too traumatized and disoriented. Winters asked when she'd first told authorities what happened. Angela said the next day, after talking with her husband and family. Winters asked if anyone had helped her remember the details or suggested how things might have occurred. Lawson objected. The judge sustained it. Winters had planted the seed of doubt, but couldn't push further without more evidence. The prosecution called additional witnesses, including the people who'd called 911 reporting my erratic driving. They testified to seeing a distressed woman in my passenger seat, a vehicle speeding through red lights, behavior consistent with someone fleeing a crime scene or engaging in a pursuit. Dr. Mendez testified about Angela's injuries, describing them as severe and consistent with assault. Under cross-examination, Winters asked if the injuries could also be consistent with a car accident or a fall. Dr. Mendez admitted they could be. Winters asked if Angela had accused me of assault when she first arrived at the hospital. Dr. Mendez checked her notes and confirmed that Angela's initial statement had been confused and non-accusatory. That inconsistency was noted, but the judge ruled there was sufficient probable cause to bind me over for trial. I was going to face a jury on kidnapping charges. The trial was set for 4 months later, giving Winters time to build our defense. Cross continued investigating Angela and Richard Kessler's relationship, looking for evidence of domestic violence or coercion. She interviewed neighbors, former employees, people who knew the couple. The picture that emerged was troubling. Multiple sources described Richard as controlling and volatile, someone who demanded absolute obedience from Angela, who monitored her activities and isolated her from friends. One former housekeeper said she'd seen bruises on Angela several times, that Angela had explained them away as accidents, but the housekeeper hadn't believed it. A neighbor recalled hearing loud arguments from the Kessler house late at night, sounds of things breaking, once seeing Angela with a black eye that she claimed came from walking into a door. But none of these people had reported anything to authorities, and none had direct evidence of abuse. Cross also discovered something crucial. Richard Kessler's business was failing. He'd over-leveraged on several development projects that had stalled during the economic downturn. He owed millions to investors and banks. Angela came from a wealthy family, old money from manufacturing. She had a trust fund worth approximately $8 million, but the terms specified she could only access it if she remained married or if her husband was proven to have engaged in domestic violence. If Angela left Richard without proving abuse, the trust would remain locked up, potentially bankrupting Richard's business empire. But if Angela could claim she'd been victimized by a third party while in distress, perhaps running from her husband, then return to Richard after he'd protected her through the legal process, the marriage would remain intact and the trust accessible. The financial motive was clear. Richard needed Angela to stay married to him, and he'd orchestrated this. False prosecution to both punish her for trying to leave and re-establish control by making her dependent on him to navigate the criminal case against me. Winters filed motions to subpoena Richard Kessler's financial records and Angela's trust fund documentation. The prosecution fought it, arguing it wasn't relevant to whether I'd kidnapped Angela. The judge agreed to limited discovery, allowing us to obtain some financial records, but not everything we wanted. What we got was enough to show Richard's desperate financial situation and Angela's substantial trust fund, but we still needed evidence directly connecting Richard to Angela's injuries or to coaching her testimony. Cross suggested we examine Route 9 where I'd found Angela, looking for evidence of what actually happened that night. If Angela had been in a car accident or been assaulted elsewhere, there might be physical evidence. Cross spent days searching the area, finally finding something significant about half a mile from where I'd picked up Angela. There were skid marks on the pavement, damage to a guardrail, and broken glass in the shoulder vegetation. The skid marks and glass were consistent with a vehicle going off the road. Cross documented everything with photographs and measurements, then traced the vehicle registration for the damaged guardrail. The county had no record of an accident reported at that location on November 6th, but Cross found paint transfer on the guardrail that didn't match my car. She had it analyzed by a forensic expert, Dr. Malcolm Green, with 18 years in automotive forensics. The paint was silver gray, consistent with a late-model Lexus. Angela Kessler drove a silver Lexus. Cross located the vehicle at the Kessler house and photographed it. The front end had been repaired recently, fresh paint and new bumper, work done at a body shop 3 days after the incident. Cross obtained the repair receipts, which showed extensive front-end damage consistent with hitting a guardrail at high speed. This was evidence that Angela had been in a single-car accident, not attacked by me. But it still didn't explain why she'd accused me of kidnapping her. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Angela's former friends, a woman named Claire Donovan, who'd been close to Angela before Richard isolated her, contacted Winters' office. Claire said she'd been following the case in the news and needed to speak with us. We met at a coffee shop away from downtown. Claire was in her late 30s, anxious, clearly afraid of retaliation. She explained that she'd known Angela since college, that they'd been best friends until Richard had systematically cut Angela off from everyone who might challenge his control. Claire described Richard as textbook abuser, charming in public, monstrously cruel in private. She said Angela had confided in her 3 years ago about the domestic violence, had briefly tried to leave Richard, but he'd threatened to destroy her reputation and drain her trust fund through legal warfare if she didn't come back. Angela had withdrawn the complaint and resumed the marriage, but Claire knew the abuse had continued. Claire said she'd reached out to Angela recently after seeing news about the kidnapping case. They'd met secretly at a park. Angela had broken down, admitted that everything she'd told police about me was a lie. According to Angela's true account, she'd finally worked up courage to leave Richard on November 6th. She'd packed a bag, taken her car, and was driving to her sister's house in another state. Richard had discovered her plan somehow, had been tracking her phone. He'd followed her on Route 9, run her off the road deliberately, then dragged her from her wrecked car and beaten her as punishment for trying to leave. He'd threatened to kill her if she ever tried again. Then he'd taken her phone and driven away, leaving her injured and stranded on that isolated road. That's when I'd found her. She'd been terrified Richard would come back, which is why she'd begged me to hurry to the hospital. At the hospital, after Angela was treated, Richard had appeared with their family. He'd pulled her aside and told her exactly what story to tell police. He said I'd attacked her and kidnapped her, that she needed to press charges against me to deflect investigation from him. He'd threatened that if she didn't comply, he'd make sure she was committed to a psychiatric facility, that he'd testify she was mentally unstable and dangerous to herself. He'd promised that if she cooperated and helped convict me, he'd forgive her attempt to leave and they could repair their marriage. Angela had been terrified, injured, isolated. She'd complied. Now she was trapped, bound by her false testimony, unable to recant without facing perjury charges and Richard's wrath. Claire had urged her to go to authorities with the truth, but Angela was too scared. Claire was coming forward herself because she couldn't watch an innocent man be destroyed while her friend remained in an abusive marriage. Winters recorded Claire's statement and immediately filed a motion to compel Angela Kessler to testify under oath about her relationship with Richard and the true events of November 6th. The motion detailed Claire's allegations, the evidence of Angela's car accident, Richard's financial motive, and the pattern of domestic abuse. The judge ordered an evidentiary hearing to examine these claims before proceeding with my trial. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks out. Winters warned me that this was risky. If Angela stuck to her false story under oath, it would strengthen the prosecution's case. But if we could get her to tell the truth, everything would unravel. The question was whether Angela would have the courage to defy Richard when it mattered. Those 2 weeks felt endless. I was still under house arrest, wearing an ankle monitor, unable to work or rebuild my life while these accusations hung over me. My savings were nearly depleted from legal fees. My reputation was destroyed. Even if I was acquitted, I'd never fully recover from this. The evidentiary hearing brought everyone back to the courthouse. The gallery was packed again, reporters everywhere, cameras outside. Angela took the stand looking terrified, her eyes darting to Richard in the front row. Winters questioned her directly about the accident evidence, the damaged guardrail, her car's repairs, the timeline that didn't match her testimony. Angela stammered through answers, claiming she didn't remember clearly, that she'd been confused. Winters presented Claire's statement, reading the detailed allegations about Richard's abuse and threats. Angela's face went pale. She looked at Richard again. He was staring at her with an expression that could only be described as murderous. Winters asked Angela directly, "Did your husband assault you on Route 9? Did he threaten you to make you lie about Kevin Brennan?" Angela's voice was barely a whisper. "I don't know. I can't remember." She was shaking, tears running down her face. The judge called a recess. During the break, something unexpected happened. Angela collapsed in the hallway outside the courtroom. Paramedics were called. She was having a panic attack, hyperventilating, unable to calm down. Richard tried to approach her, but court security stopped him. An ambulance took Angela to the hospital, and the hearing was postponed. But that evening, while Angela was being treated, she made a decision. She asked the hospital social worker to contact police. She wanted to give a new statement. the real one. Detective Cho and two other investigators went to the hospital. Angela confessed everything: the abuse, Richard running her off the road, the threats that forced her to lie, the entire conspiracy to frame me for kidnapping. She gave a 5-hour recorded statement, providing details that could be verified, naming witnesses who'd seen her injuries, before November 6th, describing Richard's surveillance and control tactics. She also agreed to wear a wire and confront Richard about what he'd done, hoping to get him to admit his actions on tape. The controlled confrontation happened the next day at the Kessler house, with police surveillance outside. Angela, wearing a recording device, told Richard she couldn't keep lying, that the truth was coming out. Richard's response was captured perfectly on tape. He admitted to running her off the road, said he'd done it to teach her a lesson about defying him. He bragged about how brilliantly he'd framed me, how he'd coached Angela's testimony, how his connections would ensure I was convicted while he remained untouchable. He threatened Angela again, said if she recanted her testimony, he'd destroy her, that no one would believe her anyway because she'd already lied under oath. He said he'd rather kill her than let her leave. Every word was recorded in crystal clear audio. Police moved in immediately, arresting Richard Kessler for attempted murder, assault, witness tampering, conspiracy to commit perjury, and about a dozen other charges. He was taken into custody, while Angela was placed in protective custody at an undisclosed location. The charges against me were dropped within 48 hours. The district attorney held a press conference apologizing for the wrongful prosecution, explaining that new evidence had exonerated me completely and revealed a complex domestic abuse situation. Jennifer Lawson, the prosecutor, called me personally to apologize, saying she'd been deceived by a manipulative abuser and his victim who'd been coerced into false testimony. The media coverage shifted immediately. Now the story was about Richard Kessler's arrest, his history of abuse, the elaborate frame job he'd orchestrated. I was no longer the villain, but the collateral damage of a violent man's need for control. My name was cleared, my reputation slowly beginning to repair, but the damage had been done. 6 months of hell that I'd never get back, relationships destroyed, career derailed, savings gone, trauma that would take years to process. Richard Kessler's trial took place 8 months later. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Angela testified for 3 days, describing years of abuse, the night he'd run her off the road, the threats that forced her to lie. The recorded conversation where he'd admitted everything was played for the jury. Claire and other witnesses corroborated Angela's account of abuse. The forensic evidence from Route 9 proved Angela's car had been in the accident at the guardrail. Richard's financial records showed his desperate need to keep Angela's trust fund accessible. His cell phone records placed him on Route 9 at the time of Angela's accident. The prosecution also revealed that Richard had tried to hire someone to intimidate Claire into recanting her statement, adding witness tampering to his charges. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Richard was sentenced to 18 years in prison with no possibility of parole for 12 years. The judge called him a dangerous predator who'd weaponized the legal system to maintain control over his victim. Angela filed for divorce immediately after Richard's conviction. The trust fund clause about domestic violence was triggered, giving her full access to her money while cutting Richard off completely. She used some of the funds to establish a foundation supporting domestic abuse survivors and wrongly accused individuals. She reached out to me through our lawyers, asking if we could meet. I agreed, curious, but also apprehensive. We met at a neutral location, a park on a sunny afternoon. Angela looked healthier than I'd ever seen her, color in her face, confidence in her posture. She apologized for everything, for the accusations, for what I'd endured because of her husband's abuse and her fear. She explained that she'd been so broken by Richard's control that she couldn't see any way out, that lying had seemed like survival even though she knew it was destroying an innocent person. I listened to everything she said. Part of me was angry, furious actually at the months of hell I'd endured because she'd been too afraid to tell the truth. But another part understood that she'd been a victim too, trapped in an impossible situation, doing what she thought was necessary to survive. I told her I accepted her apology, but that forgiveness would take time. She said she understood, that she didn't expect instant reconciliation, but she wanted me to know she was committed to making things right. She offered financial compensation for my legal fees and lost income, money from her trust fund that she wanted me to have as restitution. I initially refused, uncomfortable with taking money from someone who'd been abused, but Winters advised me to accept it. The compensation was significant, enough to cover all my legal costs and provide a cushion while I rebuilt my career. Angela and I parted with an understanding that we'd probably never be friends, but that we could move forward without active hostility. The wrongful prosecution left permanent scars. I developed anxiety about police, about being in situations where my actions could be misinterpreted. I became hyper-aware of documentation, constantly recording interactions, keeping detailed logs of my activities in case I ever needed to prove my innocence again. My therapist, Dr. Helen Nguyen, with 16 years in trauma counseling, diagnosed me with PTSD from the arrest and prosecution. She helped me process the betrayal of being punished for doing the right thing, the helplessness of being accused of a crime I didn't commit, the violation of having my entire life examined and judged by strangers. Recovery was slow and non-linear. Some days I felt fine. Other days I couldn't leave my apartment without panic attacks. Gradually, with therapy and support from friends and family, I learned to function again. I resumed freelance design work after a year, though many of my former clients never came back. The arrest had created a permanent stain, searchable online despite the charges being dropped. I had to rebuild my reputation from scratch, taking smaller projects, working twice as hard to prove my competence and reliability. Some people still believed I'd done something wrong, convinced that no smoke meant no fire, that the truth was probably somewhere between the official narrative and my claims of innocence. I learned to live with that ambiguity, with knowing that some people would always see me through the lens of accusation rather than exoneration. The experience changed my perspective on criminal justice. I'd always assumed the system worked, that innocent people didn't get prosecuted, that truth prevailed. Now I knew better. The system could be manipulated by people with resources and connections. Victims could be coerced into lying. Good Samaritans could be punished for helping. And even when truth eventually emerged, the damage was often irreparable. I stayed in contact with Winters and Cross, both of whom had become genuine friends through the ordeal. Winters said my case had reminded him why he'd become a defense attorney, to protect people who'd been wrongly accused. Cross said it was one of the most complex investigations she'd ever worked, unraveling a conspiracy that had been meticulously planned by someone who'd thought himself untouchable. Both of them told me I'd shown remarkable strength throughout the process, maintaining my composure even when everything was crumbling. I didn't feel particularly strong. I'd felt terrified and helpless most of the time. But maybe strength wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about continuing to function while afraid, about trusting the process even when it seemed rigged against you. 3 years after Richard's conviction, I was invited to speak at a conference about wrongful prosecution and domestic abuse. The organizers had asked Angela to speak as well, about her experience being coerced into false testimony. We appeared on a panel together, telling our stories to an audience of lawyers, advocates, and survivors. It was strange sitting beside her, this person who'd been both victim and victimizer in my life. But it was also healing. We'd both survived Richard's cruelty, both rebuilt our lives from the destruction he'd caused. Angela had become an advocate for abuse survivors, using her experience and resources to help women escape dangerous relationships. I'd become more conscious of how easily justice could be perverted, more willing to question official narratives and support the accused until truth emerged. The final piece of closure came unexpectedly. I was contacted by a journalist named Neil Whitmore who was writing a book about wrongful prosecutions and wanted to feature my case. I agreed to participate, seeing it as an opportunity to tell the complete story, to correct the public record that still contained distorted versions of events. The book was published 2 years later, a comprehensive examination of how I'd been framed and eventually exonerated. It included interviews with everyone involved: me, Angela, Winters, Cross, Detective Cho, who admitted he'd initially misjudged the case, even Jennifer Lawson, who discussed how prosecutors can be manipulated by victims who appear credible. The book didn't become a bestseller, but it reached enough people that my name was finally, truly cleared in public consciousness. I still think about that night on Route 9, the moment I saw Angela stumbling along the roadside and made the split-second decision to help. If I could go back, knowing everything that would follow, would I still stop? The answer is yes. Despite the nightmare that ensued, despite months of hell and trauma and financial ruin, I'd still stop. Because someone was dying and needed help, and the alternative was driving past and letting her die. Richard Kessler had weaponized my humanity, turned compassion into evidence of criminality, but he hadn't destroyed my belief that helping others was the right choice. That belief survived everything he did. So did I. That's the victory he never got to take away. If you made it this far through this story, hit like. You've earned it, and so have all the people who refuse to stop helping even when help comes with terrible costs. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.